Okay, so let's discuss or start exploring our discussion on anaerobic capacity and how we go about measuring that. In particular, we're going to talk about muscular work versus power, okay, and some tests that we can do that. But first, we have to figure out this definition. So, work is, by definition, a force applied over a distance, and we could even throw in a cosine theta or the angle at which this is applied at. But for our discussion, it's easy enough to just think a force times a distance. If a force is present, then an object or a mass is going to be moving. And we know that because a force equals a mass times acceleration. And if something's accelerating, it's moving forward, it's picking up velocity. And we use a unit called joule. So joule is also a SI unit for energy. So energy and work are very much related, and so they have a common unit here. And the definition of a joule is 1 Newton of force. So newtons are again, the unit that we use to describe a force, and it's that force applied over a meter. So we can also call it a Newton meter is a joule. If you need to conceptualize this, there's a lot of different units kind of pitched around there. But if you take an apple, so roughly about like 100-gram apple, which is a fair average size apple, and you lift that up 1 meter, the amount of force and energy that goes into that is roughly a joule. Okay. We can also see that work is expressed as a kilogram meter or a kilopond. Kilopond, I think, is a little less commonly used, but a kilogram meter is certainly used on some pieces of equipment like a Wingate machine or a cycle ergometer. And and so that's work again. Ultimately applying some force for some amount of distance, that is going to be work. And that kind of is expressed as a concept of energy. Okay. Now, if we take a peek at power, we want to think of this as a rate. So how quick or how explosive is the amount of work being done? Okay, so if you notice here, we look at work, there's nothing to talk about time. But with power, we have work over time, which is the same as saying a force times a distance over time. When we have these equations or definitions or explanations of something being over time, we're just saying it's a rate at which something is occurring. And in this case, it's how much work is occurring for any given amount of time. Now, a very similar way we can say the same thing as a force times a velocity. Now, velocity is the change in displacement or an object's position over time. So again, we have this over time occurring. It's just in this variable here as velocity versus having the whole equation or force time or work over time. Excuse me. So we'll see here that power is expressed in watts. And so the unit that it can also convert to is a joule per second. And that is literally what we just defined as work over time is a joule, right? We said work is expressed in joules. So we have a joule over time, which is seconds for our international units, scientific units of seconds. And when we're looking at power, we use this concept quite often. I mean, we use both work and power oftentimes in our day-to-day language interchangeably, and that's not necessarily correct. So definitely something you want to keep in mind as you use those terms moving forward in your exams, papers, and schooling. Okay. So we'll take a look here at our anaerobic capacity and strength measures or ways that we go about looking at those. And as we take a peek here, we see that these tests also, like your aerobic tests, look at how well you can synthesize ATP, but they look to quantify how well that occurs in anaerobic activities in particular. If you recall seeing the Wingate test, that is probably the number one go-to as far as a test for your anaerobic capacity. It's a 30-second sprint all out on the cycle ergometer. Yeah, it's if you ever get the opportunity to do it, please do. It is certainly an event for sure. Our anaerobic treadmill test, we can also call a running sprint test, but it's just a slight variation. So you have your treadmill, you have someone running at 20% gradient and 8 miles per hour. It's 7 miles per hour for women. And you essentially just see how long you can stay on. And that length of time is an indicator of how good your anaerobic capacity is. So if you think of 20%, like 45 is there, so roughly about 20% here. So you're running on a very steep incline. It's very challenging. Also highly suggest you do that anytime you get a chance. Vertical jump test. Many of you have done this in lab and know what that's about. Again, the idea is seeing what sort of lower body capacity you have. And again, that's more of a creatine phosphate level, unless you do a repeated jump test for a certain duration of time, say like 30 seconds, then you start looking more at your glycolytic system, okay? Again, Wingate test looks at to completely tax your CP system, creatine phosphate, and then dig deep into the glycolytic, okay? Running sprint tests, we'll see these have a bunch of different forms, but they have a set amount of distance to cover, and they standardize the time to be done in them. You might have come across these with a shuttle run, where you have a couple of bean bags set a certain amount of distance apart. You have to run, pick one up, drop it off, pick up the other one, move it, drop it off, and shuttle back and forth. Now, things that can affect these tests, so the Wingate, well, any, but if I'll use the Wingate as a prime example here. Motivation to perform at one's best. Remember, these are maximum effort for a very short amount of time. If you're not giving 100% of effort or performance, you don't truly get a good anaerobic read on that skill. The skill at performing the movement. So for example, if this is a new test, if you're doing a Wingate and you don't do a lot of cycling, in and of itself, that is a specific skill that you need to perform, and those that are more proficient at it certainly can have their results bolstered by that experience. Those that have had less experience cycling will have maybe a poorer performance than they might actually be able to do. The degree of coordination is related to that. Ultimately, I'd say that would come up more with the running. So there's more degrees of freedom that our bodies can move through, more range of motion, and therefore our degree of coordination while running is a big part of it. And when you get put on a treadmill that's at 20% gradient, definitely you need some coordination there, and so that will come into play. Your muscle fiber type composition will definitely indicate or be found, or you could predict it a little bit based off of the results of these tests. So for example, if you performed really, really well, it's likely that you have a lot of type 2 muscle fiber percentage composition, relatively speaking, to others who don't perform as well. But that being said, it could just be an underlying composition and you don't have it trained up maximally yet. So there might be some room to improve, or potentially you're just you get a false high reading, or slightly lower because you don't have your type 2 muscle fibers quite trained up, or the intermediate fibers, sorry. Okay, body composition can be part of it. If we think about vertical jump test, body composition can come into play. Again, it's not just specifically mass, but it's the difference between body fat percentage and free fat mass, right? So again, the point being, and some of you had good discussions about this in your labs, or I've seen good discussions about this, where you can have a lot of mass, but it could be muscle mass, and that muscle mass will, yes, increase your weight, but that will, especially if it's lower body muscle mass, will produce a lot of vertical jumping capacity for you. So even though your mass, or your weight more specifically, could be on, say, more than another individual, relatively speaking, if it's more lower body versus upper body muscle mass, that would be beneficial. If you had more fat-free mass, so we're talking about more muscle versus having more fat mass, that would also be beneficial. So in other words, being a bit more lean would be beneficial to a vertical jump test. But certainly, proportionately, as far as like height and that sort of thing, because it's all relative to your height as a starting position, that would have less of an influence or factor. Okay. So we're to look at specifically strength now. There are a number of different ways to look at this. Again, we looked at a standardized version of calisthenics. So how do we use our own body and body weight to perform a certain number of exercises and then get a gauge of our strength, more specifically our strength endurance oftentimes for those, say, timed strength tests that we did, push-up tests, sit-up tests, etc. Because you have a finite amount of time to do as many push-ups or sit-ups as you can until you stop, right? So that's one way. But when we're looking at the maximal amount of force you can produce, so this is not repeated sub-maximal force for a duration of time, or close to maximal force for a duration of time, but absolutely like one repetition maximum sort of lift. There are a few different avenues that we need to take. So free weights is one way to do that, and there's a lot of different protocols that you can use to get up to a 1 rep max, a 5 rep, a 3, a 10, and they'll all be predictors of your 1 rep max or maximum strength. Typically they involve setting up the barbell with a certain amount of weight, an approximate of, let's say, 80% of your max or 70% of your max. You do 5 reps and you kind of warm up, and then you take a 5-minute break and go back and add on either 5 or 10 pounds, depending whether it's your upper or lower body getting more weight, until you get to the point where you can't lift any more repetitions, and then you get to find your rep max that way. There's other machines that use certain resistance, or I'll speak to more so our isokinetic dynameters. Sorry, oh my goodness. And what you do with that is essentially they don't move, and say you pull the bar as if you're going to do a deadlift, but the barbell is locked into a rack that has a version of a force plate, so it can measure how much force you generate, and you just sit there and pull, and you'll end up seeing both the rate of your max force contraction, but also what your maximal force generation is. And those are really, really good at finding out true muscular strength, more so I would say probably than free weights. And if you can get EMG or electromyography electrodes hooked up with that, that gives you some more information too. Okay, so 2 tests in particular that we can look at is a grip dynameter and a 1 rep max test. We already spoke about that, but for the grip strength test, or the grip dynameter, it measures our isometric force in our grip strength. Now, one of the things to recall, and again this comes up in your lab, is that your grip strength is actually a really good indicator of your upper body strength. Because what happens is you get this concept of irradiation is what it's called, where when you're squeezing your grip as hard as you can, you start recruiting more and more muscle groups throughout your upper body to try to add more grip strength through your hand. So again, with a maximal effort, you're going to recruit as much upper body strength as you can to try to transfer that force into your grip strength. It's a pretty good measure. I wouldn't say it's a perfect measure by any means, but that's definitely one way you can do it. Another way you can look at strength and force production of your muscles is using a force plate machine of different types. So there is the traditional force plates that are just squares on the ground that look like a scale that you step on and will measure your force that you produce on them. They have other systems that have different directions that measure force production. So here, I could be either pressing outward or inward with my hips to test my hip strength. And the great thing about these, especially in a clinical setting, so this is actually at a friend's physio clinic that he was working at, is you can actually, again, by applying that force inward or outward, you can get independent measures from your left to right sides or cumulative, and you can see again a 1 rep isometric maximum strength generation for different muscle groups. So you can set this up as well to, for example, do internal and external rotation of your hand. If you put your elbow down, there's others where you can actually hook your legs into it and do a Nordic hamstring curl. So it's essentially you tip out and pull yourself back up. And again, you can see left-right imbalances that way. Okay, so a few new kind of points as far as our strength and anaerobic system measures. I would probably, again, obviously in our lab, we go into these tests in a lot greater detail, but hopefully this was a few reminder, some key points as far as strength endurance, as well as our creatine phosphate or our glycolytic systems, as far as our anaerobic tests and systems that we're looking to test. Okay. That's all for this one. Thanks.